Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. As part of the University of Wolverhampton's Black History Month programme, we are pleased to present a talk with playwright and journalist Juliet Gilkes-Romero. Juliet is an award-winning stage and screenwriter. Her plays include The Whip, which examines the fight to pass the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. For the next hour, Juliet will be chatting to Dr. Daisy Black, lecturer in English literature here at the university, and Ifemu Omari-Webber, a third-year PhD student also at the University of Wolverhampton. Welcome everyone. Over to you, Daisy.
Thank you. I'm really just here to say a bit more about Juliet's career and generally fangirl slightly. Juliet completed her MA in writing for performance at Goldsmith College before starting a distinguished career as a journalist. She's reported for the BBC in countries all over the world, including Cuba, Ethiopia, Haiti, and Dominican Republic. And she's received awards, including the BBC's Alexander Onassis Bursary and the Roland Rees Bursary. Juliet's written for TV, radio, and theatre, and has worked with the Royal Shakespeare Company, Donmar Warehouse, and Manchester Royal Exchange, amongst others. Her plays include Bilad Al-Sudan, The Gates of Gaza, which won the 2009 Writers Guild of Great Britain Best Play Award, and The Day of Living. But we're here today to talk about The Whip, which was performed just before lockdown at the RSC's Swan Theatre between February and March this year. This brilliantly titled play, I'm a sucker for a poignant pun, covers the political manipulations and power games of politicians in 1833 when they gathered to discuss the terms of abolishing the slave trade. One key sticking point is whether or not slave owners should be paid for the loss of their human property. Yet this play's focus isn't just on those in the room where it happens, but also on characters kept outside the official structures of power. Former slave and parliamentary assistant Edmund, abolitionist Mercy Price, and ex-mill worker Horatia Poskett. And it's this play that Juliet's going to talk about today. In the second half, Juliet will be interviewed by my colleague, Ifemu Omari-Webber, whose PhD focuses exactly on this period of history and the importance of testimonies of women such as Mary Price, who served as a model for one of the main characters in this play. Welcome, Juliet.
Hello all, and thank you for having me. Yes, I want to say that I am interested in unearthing untold stories and inconvenient political truths. And, I wrote The Whip to do exactly that. It's set during the unprecedented collision of the Abolition Act, the Factory Act, and the reform rights so that working class people could actually vote. So it's like a 19th century political drama about radicalism and revolution, and kind of underpinned by the creeping dystopia of fake news, media manipulation and blackmail. It's a story about the power of political solidarity, which for the main protagonist is both dangerous and revolutionary, and which casts a very long shadow over the contentious legacy of Britain's slave trade. So events open up through the eyes of Edmund, who's a runaway slave, and he's the ward of the government's chief whip. And he would like to become the first ever Black MP in training. So hopefully we can show some of those pictures from the production. And one of the things that for Edmund, it's his memories which have been fragmented, and he says, I stare at shipping charts and search for the memory of faces and of a mother and a father, brothers and sisters, but remember nothing except my mother singing. So he's quite lost. Mercy Price is a runaway slave, an orator fighting for survival and abolition, and she's based on the real life Mary Prince. And I'll explain why I created Mercy as opposed to using the real life Mary Prince a bit later on. And then we have a wonderful character called Horatia Poskett. She's a jobless migrant from the north, a social agitator, and her daughter has died in a cotton mill, and she's seeking a new lease of life, but also to champion the Factory Act. And then, of course, we have the government's chief whip, who is charged with delivering the compromised abolition bill and the bailout of slave owners, some of whom sit in Parliament. while he's trying to do this. So I wrote this play because, you know, the transatlantic slave trade was the biggest deportation in history. And it was a determining factor of the world economy in the 18th century. Millions of Africans were torn from their homes, deported to the American continent, the Caribbean, Latin America, sold as slaves. I myself am descended from the survivors of that trade. So for me, it was I had a burning issue to address this and to how to tell this story. I'd seen Roots, 12 Years a Slave, but I really was looking for a different way to tell it. I was invited to a day of provocation at the RSC. And actually that was my first introduction to the Royal Shakespeare Company. And the event was hosted by Erica Wyman and playwright Mark Ravenhill. And we, along with other playwrights and social agitators, debated the unsayable, the unthinkable, the inexplicable. And the result was a no holds barred and uncensored discussion about race, religion, capitalism and war. And, you know, out of that, I then began to look at the morality of debt. And then I realized that that actually was my way into the play, because I wanted to write about how the slave owners were compensated for the loss of their property. Helping me along this journey was the fact that HM Treasury put out a tweet in 2018 announcing that the multi-billion slavery compensation bill, one of the biggest in UK history, had finally been paid off by us, the British taxpayers, in February 2015. And I'll just let that really sink in. This is the one piece of information that I've dramatized in the play that gets everybody every time. And I've been interviewed in you know, on TV, radio, you know, Canadian Broadcasting Company. People can't believe that we didn't know about this. And with my journalism, with my background as a journalist, you know, for me, it was also a journey of discovery. I mean, I didn't know, and I was pretty annoyed that I didn't know, and why this isn't really being taught in schools. There is a Guardian article which kind of like explains how this tweet then rapidly kind of spread across social media platforms. And HM Treasury actually deleted the tweet, which actually made it worse, because more and more people wanted to know what on earth was this about. And I remember David Olusogun got onto it very quickly, and a very dramatic story was kind of born as a result of all of that. So, as I say, I specialize in untold stories and inconvenient political truths, and I believe it's, you know, I believe that telling history is an important genre which allows us to examine these issues with a margin of creative license. I'm not a historian. I am an observer. I think I'm obsessed by memory and conflict, and I kind of want audiences to come and experience my take on events and to discover something fresh or new. I would say that my motto is never lie, never go against known facts. When writing history, as Hilary Mantel says, historical truth it's a rough beast, and it's hard to tame in its fight, you know, if it begins to fight against you. And certainly in journalism, you know, you're only as good as your last story. So if you lose the trust of your audience, that's very hard to claw back and to be taken seriously again. So with the Whip, my tools were research, and research again. I went to the House of Commons library, and I also applied for the Freedom of Information Act, and I think we've got that to show you as well. so that I could be satisfied and prove that everybody in this country who worked up until 2015, their tax money went into paying off this bailout, the modern equivalent of some £20 billion. So this is one of my starting points, because I think that when you're telling a story like this, there are elements of it which would seem really unbelievable. I also managed to get hold of the original Abolition Act of 1833. And I think that what was really surprising when I read it, and it's in tiny print, we've managed to expand a bit for you to see. What really surprised me about it was the clause regarding the apprenticeships, which they wanted to establish once emancipation had allegedly been legalized. So what it meant was not only did the slave owners receive millions of pounds in compensation for loss of their property, they then received the free labor of their slaves. They were compelled to work for their previous owners for no money at all, and that was to last 7 years. But by 1838, through activism, rebellion, the British government had to get rid of the apprenticeships because it wasn't emancipation. They were not freed. And also, if you are an apprentice, as opposed to a slave, your owner doesn't really have to worry about clothing you and feeding you in the way that he would do if he owned you. It's like owning a car. You know, if it breaks down, you've got to look after it. You know, if you're leasing that car, you're not so worried about it. And the conditions that the apprentices suffered were far worse than slavery itself. And in fact, a special police force was gathered and taken out to the Caribbean and the colonial territories to compel these slaves to work for their former masters. So, you know, does historical drama have a duty to be factually accurate? The art form certainly comes with an ocean of challenges. And again, as a journalist, you know, I think that research is really important, but I have to kind of throw that research over my shoulder and really dig down and deep with the characters, because it's the characters who will carry the story and hopefully inspire the audience. But there are pitfalls. I have a link to a film. It's a BBC article about a film called U571. And what interested me as I was researching, and especially because I felt a real sense of responsibility to the accuracy of the backdrop that I was trying to share with an audience. So basically, Hollywood made a film about this U-boat, but it sailed into a huge storm and controversy for ignoring historical facts. So the real life submariner who boarded the German U-boat was a man called David Baum, who was key to helping turn the tide of World War II when he led this boarding party and captured an Enigma cipher machine and documents which contained coded German military messages. But what Hollywood did was to they made the British submariners American, and the heroes are played by Matthew McConaughey, John Bon Jovi, and Harvey Keitel. And no doubt it was a great action film, but you know, for me personally, why do that? I mean, I know it was American money which went into making the film, but even so, American audiences were left with the impression that this incredible turning point in the conflict, they believed that it was that it was commanded by American sailors, and that's not the case. And today, you know, we are in this murky world of alternative facts, and it's really gained traction, particularly during the kind of first term of Donald Trump's presidency. His press secretary cited figures about Donald Trump's inauguration and the amount of people who attended, and he justified this by saying it's all about alternative facts. So I think, even though I'm not a historian, I do take very seriously my responsibility to really getting the accuracy of the history correct, even if I'm creating fictional characters. There was a series on, I think it was ITV, called Victoria. It was about the young Queen, and in it they portrayed Lord Melbourne, who went on to become the Prime Minister. In my play, he's the Home Secretary, and they have Queen Victoria falling in love with him and actually proposing marriage, and the drama came in for a lot of criticism, though it was very exciting to see this on film. And it was one reason why I renamed, so I had a character who was based on Lord Melbourne, but I renamed him Lord Maybourne because I was unable to prove unequivocally how many slaves he may have actually owned at the time. And I didn't want to weigh down the whip in any kind of factual controversy, because I felt that the story was absolutely too important. And I'd spent so much time, you know, reading and researching and going through Hansard from 1833 to 1831 to try to get it as accurate as possible. So a lot of my work is historical. I think we've got a picture there of At the Gates of Gaza, which was a play that I wrote about the British West Indies Regiment, which fought in the First World War. And I researched this at the Imperial War Museum. And the staff there were wonderful. And actually, they gave me the diaries of men who had unfortunately passed away during the conflict. So At the Gates of Gaza is set in what was Palestine in 1917, and it's about how the British West Indies Regiment was recruited and how they fought with honour. And I think one of the reasons why I had to tell this story is because no one knew about them. You know, everyone knows about the New Zealanders and the Australians who fought in the First World War. There's a famous film starring Mel Gibson called Gallipoli, but the contribution of the British West Indies Regiment has been completely erased and certainly not taught in schools. And what I learned was that it wasn't government policy to photograph these troops, and they were barred from marching in the victory parades, which is a terrible thing because, again, it erases their presence from very important events. And another reason why I needed to write this, because when I was working in BBC News, BBC World in particular, our presenters then were not allowed to wear poppies, and the feeling was that an overseas audience wouldn't know what a poppy, what the symbol was, which was ridiculous because, you know, the First World War was a world war. There are cenotaphs all over the Caribbean. I had relatives who fought in the First World War. There are cenotaphs all over the Middle East and Africa. So I then followed that with a radio play called One Hot Summer, and hopefully you can see a bit of the text there, because then what happened, because the public weren't told about the Black troops who fought in the First World War, when these men were demobilized, they were attacked. And the problem was, after the war, Britain was bankrupt. The police were on strike, miners were on strike, and on top of that, there was mass unemployment as well. So the country was a tinderbox, and you had men who were coming back from war, trained in weaponry and fighting, and race riots broke out. They started in Liverpool, spread to Cardiff, to Glasgow, around the country and into London. And interestingly, the same riots were mirrored in the United States, where returning Black servicemen were also found themselves under fire. They had, fought for democracy and racial equality, but when the fighting was done, the status quo snapped back to what it was, and nobody wanted to entertain the newfound confidence that these troops had. So I did it as a radio documentary. I went to the British Library, got newspapers from 1919 and wove it into the fabric of the drama, because the events are quite hard to believe, and hard to believe that people died in these riots in 1919, especially when we don't, know about these things. So this is why I think it's really important, why I am really invested in historical drama, because we saw events in Bristol, for example, when the statue of Edward Colston came down, and a lot of people would have been aghast. What's this? Why are people attacking British history and the legacy of it? But what a lot of viewers didn't realise was that for many decades, there'd been Edward Colston on his plinth had been an open wound in Bristol because he was a slave trader. And according to records, some 20% of his cargo, and that's men, African men, women and children, died because of the most appalling conditions in his boats. But he became fantastically rich. He built almshouses, schools for English people in Bristol, and he became celebrated. But it was blood money, because all of this wealth came because of the slave trade. And unless we understand our past, it's very difficult for us to find common ground. And this is why, I wanted to tell the whip, because people don't understand the legacy of slavery. They think it's something that happened in the past. They think that the slaves were relatively well treated. And what I discovered, the House of Commons Library and through the Freedom of Information Act, was actually this was a lot more complex and challenging than any kind of narrative that we might find, if we're lucky, in a school book. I've included an image of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, again to talk around the subject of historical drama. This picture inspired a play called The Meeting. It was written in 1987 by an American playwright called Jeff Stetson. In truth, the two, they met briefly for about 5 minutes, as you see in the picture. But Jeff brilliantly wrote a play about an imagined meeting, which he placed in 1965 in a Harlem hotel at the height of the civil rights movement. And but what he did, because he researched the characters so well, he extrapolated who they were. You have your pacifist and civil rights warrior, but the play is far more nuanced than that. And in it, Jeff uses arm wrestling between the two characters. And in the first match, Malcolm X wins. He wins the first contest. Martin Luther King wins the second, and then the third match ends in a draw. And after that, this final encounter, both men are physically spent. There's no victor determined, And Martin Luther King makes the very poignant observation that just imagine what we could have accomplished if we joined hands in the same direction. This was a play that I read prior to writing The Whip, which gave me the confidence to use history, but to use a bit of creative license when it came to creating my characters. So I created this wonderful woman called Mercy Price, who was played by Debbie Corley. And Mercy Price was based on the real life Mary Prince. And the reason why I didn't use or write Mary Prince into my narrative was that unfortunately she died just before the abolition bill was made law. And I wanted to create a Black female character who could be involved in that action and debate. But Mary Prince was the first Black woman to ever present a petition to Parliament, the House of Commons, asking for slavery to end. She was a great orator. Her autobiography, or rather her biography, was written while she was alive, and she toured Britain describing the inhuman conditions on slave plantations in the colonies, and she talked about her own experiences of being whipped and mistreated, being separated from her children. She eventually, her owners brought her to the UK, and in 1807, slavery had been abolished on British soil, but not on colonial, in the colonies. So once you could get to British soil, you could be free. And she ran away from her owners when they came to London and worked with abolitionists in London and Birmingham to try to bring an end to slavery. And as I say, she died just short of that. But what a wonderful inspiration. And again, when reading the meeting and looking how Jeff Stetson rebuilt Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, I kind of rebuilt Mary Prince and gave her an agency in the Whip, which is also very much about women. It's not a single issue play. As I said at the beginning, this is a play which is a crucible where abolition, the Factory Act, which was trying to get rid of child slavery in this country in cotton mills, and the kind of fallout of the Reform Act, which brought in, allowed working class men to vote and brought in the first MPs who were not of elite or the gentry, because prior to that, you didn't have to earn a living to be an MP, which meant that you had to be extremely wealthy to sit in the House of Commons. So after 1831, working men, you still had to be able to earn a certain amount of money, were allowed to vote and become MPs. So I'd say that, as I said, my mission as a playwright is always to unravel what has been, has lain untold and buried for political expediency. The Abolition Act, it freed 800,000 Caribbean slaves at the same time that working people in Britain were examining their own working conditions, particularly of children who were being forced to labour 15, 16 hours. And I also went to Quarry Bank Mill to research Horatia's story and the demise of her child, so that I could bring these themes together. And for me, that's what was most exciting about writing The Whip, because a lot of people, there were people who actually dismissed it as, oh, another slave play, but actually it's British history. And I feel that's really important. And it's given me, it's been a real labour of love to write this play. And I'm just excited that I can share it with audiences. Unfortunately, we lost 1 week because of the lockdown, but we do hope that it will get to London and abroad. And I thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand over to Ifemu to continue. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that very complex trajectory. I think one of the things I love about the Whip is what I call parallel stories. Often you get stories that are singularly told, almost like Black history and Black British history, as if that is the only thing that is going on in that moment. And the idea of paralleling it with another story that was happening at the same time about the Factory Act and the horrors of the mills up north, you know, I really commend you on. I am slightly concerned with our story about Mary Prince or Mercy Price, because even our historians sometimes get it wrong. I'm excited about Mary Prince because she was illiterate and she used her, it's almost cunning to get to Britain in 1828, by which time she was bought by 5 different masters. Wood was the 5th master. And so I really wanted to ask you, in terms of Mercy Price, who is she? She seems like a combination of Mary Seacole, the orator, and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. And the other thing about petitioning in the 19th century wasn't like petitioning now. You really had to have a network of people advocating for you. And Mary Prince was very lucky in that regard, that when she came to London, she was literally, not through her choice, just happenstance, amongst the Bloomsbury set, and they were able to network, put pressure on MPs and bring her petition to Parliament. So who else is Mary Prince a kind of mosaic of?
I would say that you've mentioned the most important ones, and also Horatio is a mosaic of women, and I'll get to that in a moment. We took the cast to the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
Yeah.
And we were shown the petition bag, which hangs at the back of the Speaker's chair. It was. I mean, we got goosebumps, and we also had the dispatch box. And we talked about Mary Prince and how she was able, through the Bloomsbury set, to petition the House of Commons. So a lot of her story drove the creation of Mercy Price. But Mercy is she's cunning, and she's educated, and that's what fascinates me about these abolitionists. You know, or Frederick Douglass, who came to this country, taught this country. They were eloquent. They were good speakers. They could hold a room of people and tell a story and inspire people to decide that, you know, a trade like the slave trade was immoral. And this is how, you know, it was ended, because there were a lot of petitions, particularly from women, but also because the British government realised that this was not fit for purpose. They were terrified. After the Haitian Revolution, there were rebellions right across the Caribbean, and they were the first to recognise. I mean, the French were slow, even after Haiti. The Americans hung on to that trade. The whole issue of compensation went to Congress, and they couldn't, North and South couldn't agree. And it led to their civil war, in which 600,000 died. So what's fascinating is the agency of women in the political debate in the play and of the time, because there's a real social awakening of women's activism, which I really wanted to show, because the play is about the 2 women, really. The play is about Mercy and Horatio. But also to compare and contrast what happened in the States, though what I do define is how Britain was afraid of letting go of the slave trade because of its perfidious rivals in the Americas. They didn't know what was on the other ends or the other side of walking away from it, a bit like with Brexit, no one knows what's on the other side of Brexit. If we crash out of the EU, what's going to happen to our economy? When you think that the British government borrowed 40% of its national budget to pay off these slaveholders, and we finished paying for that in 2015, and we're not taught about that at schools. And that's why creating characters like Mary, Prince, and Horatio for an audience, because at the end of the day, I am a dramatist and I have to create compelling characters so that the audience can walk in everybody's shoes, and as you say, this is British history. I use, the social conditions of the time and the fight to end child labour to really drive the drama through, but to really kind of grab the audience by the throat, if you like, and give them a good shake and to remind them that these are the things that we don't talk about, and this is our common ground. Freedom, social justice, racial justice.
And the women, in terms of commonality, there's some humor with the women, because Horatia is working class from the mills, trying to reinvent herself, reinvent her life. And in a way, so is, I'm going to say Mary Prince, because so is Mercy Price. And they clash in a very gentle way at one point, thinking that the white female Horatia thinks that the black woman must be a servant, and vice versa. Mercy Price thinks that Horatia must be somebody's housekeeper. So it's really interesting how those stereotypes happen with females. What I find also quite exciting is what we'd call intersectionality today, where the men, say Edmund, who has been oppressed and is trying to find his way out, are criticizing the women for for almost speaking above their station. So again, I love this kind of the nuanced kind of aspect of your play. Do you want to say anything about that, especially Edmund?
I decided that Edmund would be a young man of the time, and he would absorb the social mores from those around him, particularly Boyd. Boyd is raising him to be a gentleman, and as we find out that he's having a bet with Lord Maybourne, Edmund into a gentleman. Edmund had been snatched from Africa, passed around, ended up on a Portuguese slave ship, chained to a kitchen table and made to serve meals, and was branded as a child, and manages to escape when into the Pool of London through one of the voyages of the ship, ends up with the poor and destitute street children, and is rescued by Boyd, who is a social reformer, or he would like to think he is. And he's horrified, and he wants to give Edmund an opportunity, and is raising him a bit like his son, a bit like with Francis Barber and Samuel Johnson. So I use that as a bit of a parallel. But so he's raising this young runaway slave, but of course, the society was not generous to women and their intelligence and their desire to vote. And that was the other thing, people think of the suffragettes starting at a particular era. My goodness, slaves wanted to vote, female slaves wanted to vote. This was pre what we know as the suffragette era, and Horatia and Mercy are very much part of that. Yes, Edmund's attitude to women are those that he has acquired in his environment. It's a bit like Pygmalion, so he has the same views as Boyd. There were male abolitionists who did not want women in the movement. Wilberforce was one of them, and he also had a rotten borough. You know, there's a certain narrative around Wilberforce, and I'm honest, my play is not about his narrative. I talk about Thomas Clarkson, who boarded slave ships, and it was his research. He would interview people and try to help, and he gave his research to Wilberforce, who then disowned him. You know, and in fact, one of Clarkson's descendants is a very good friend of mine, and she came to see the play, and it was a very powerful moment for us both to sit there, with myself as a descendant from the trade, and her as a descendant from a man who was several times attacked, and they tried to kill him because, you know, he was so ferociously active against the slave trade itself. But yes, so in reading Hansard and really absorbing the mores of the times, I had to present Edmund as he would have been at the time and what he would have acquired in the household where he was raised. So there's a lot of tension between Edmund and Horatia when she comes to work for Boyd. As far as he's concerned, you know, go back to the north.
Yeah.
You know, no work for you here. You're a woman on your own. What are you doing? You know, and I'm in charge of the house. Boyd knows nothing. I run the household. I had a lot of fun with that.
The women. There's a part in the play where you can see them growing towards each other. They're kind of dancing around and not quite maybe understanding, maybe trusting each other. But somehow they understand towards the end that they have their commonalities. But at the end of the play, they walk in their distant ways. They walk in opposite directions. What is that symbolic of?
That's not the way it's supposed. It ends with them gathering information and sharing it together, and agreeing to meet regularly in Hyde Park, whether it rains or not. And we see two major scenes of them in Hyde Park, trying to be orators, speaking about the things that they're passionate about, whereas actually Mercy is accepted because she's a black woman. Everyone can see she's a black woman. They know that she's a runaway slave and she's there to talk about abolition. When Horatia gets on her soapbox, she's beaten up and arrested because she starts to preach about the working class and freedom, which is seen as seditious, whereas Mercy is seen as other. So that was very interesting to track. But so the play ends with Mercy gathering information for Horatia about politicians who have interests and murky interests in cotton mills, and Horatia is gathering and stealing evidence about MPs who are against ending the apprenticeship scheme. So the play does end with them together. And actually a lot of people have asked me, what happens next? A lot of people want to see a play or even a TV drama about Mercy and Horatia. And I would love to do that. There's a lot of interest at the moment, you know, to take it to small screen, big screen. There's a lot of talk at the moment, but it's gratifying that people have been inspired to want more, because we just don't get these stories.
The way you talk about, well, the way you portray violence is very sensitive. We've got the scar on Edmund's neck. We've got Mercy Price telling the story of some brutality, and you have somebody fainting in the audience. What is your take on how to continue to deal with violence episodes in people's lives?
It was, you know, my motto in a sense is that if I cannot upset myself on the page, I'm being too polite. And you know, the interval comes just after Horatia has been beaten up. So Mercy talks, and we know that she's scarred on her back, and she reveals that. But when she's at a public meeting describing how her sister became crippled on this contraption called the treadmill, which was used in British prisons, and they took them out, strapped up by your wrists, and you would have to keep treading, and if you stopped, the steps were just like a giant, batter your legs and your knees roar and break them. So I remember when I wrote that monologue for Mercy, being uncomfortable, worrying about the actress, because Debbie, who played that role, had to go through quite a journey in the play, and I try not to pull any punches, because they're stories from the slave trade which aren't told, and in many ways, I guess, the play is polite in comparison to actual record. And then, as I say, when Horatia finds her voice and she discovers that she is an orator, she's punished for it, and she's savagely beaten and dragged off to a police cell. And I used to worry that people wouldn't come back after the interval, but they always did. And I'm gratified by that. And I would like to think it's because they cared about the characters and they wanted to see what happened to Horatia and what was her journey. When you end, or you go into an interval on a point like that, it's, as a writer, you have a responsibility to really push through those issues of violence against women, being voiceless, and what happens when women do find their voices. They've both lost their daughters in horrible circumstances. And then also Edmund describes, so there's a scene where Edmund and Horatia are basically sharing their scars. I mean, Horatia scarred up her forearms from when she tried to pull her daughter out of the spinning mule, which caught her by the hair and dragged her in. And she's horribly scarred by that. And I remember actually when we were in rehearsal and they put the scars on Kat, who played Horatia, and there's a character called Bradshaw Cooper who finds himself compromised because of his grandfather's role in the mills. When she holds her arms up to show Boyd, what's happened to her and why she wants him to prosecute Bradshaw Cooper. In rehearsals, Tom McCall, who played Bradshaw Cooper, cried. He'd just become a father. He had a newborn at home, and it hit him in a way that he didn't really expect. So that there is a lot of allusion to violence. There is violence on stage, and there's a lot of scarring, which plays into the whip. So you've got the government whip, and then the kind of metaphor of the whip itself. And also in rehearsals, I mean, Richard Clothier, who played Boyd, and I remember sitting next to him, and he'd be in tears, and he'd say, well, I'm not Black, but this is taking me to a place in my history that I didn't know. He would be powerfully moved during rehearsals, all of the cast, to be honest, all of them. And but I think that if you can generate that genuine emotion and response dramatically, you've got a great opportunity of carrying an audience with you, because I'm not giving a history lesson. At the end of the day, The Whip is not a history lesson. It's a compelling piece of drama about people. It's about the human condition and how our morals are challenged when we have to make difficult decisions. And each character has to make unspeakable decisions. And it's about how they get there, and how that can be sometimes accompanied by violence.
Violence, voicelessness, Black Lives Matter. So, Juliet, when your play comes back again, because it must, how, in the light of what we've experienced over the world, all over the globe, with the repercussions of the unfortunate death of George Floyd. What do you think audiences will see your play differently because there may now be a different lens? Is there a different lens? And another one, because I've got to do a 2-in-1. What is the final, if you had one message that you wanted us to take away from your play, regardless of gender, race, religion, one message, one singular learning message, what would it be? So Black Lives Matter and the lens through which we look, and what is the lesson?
Okay, I'll deal with the first question. And we knew, I mean, you know, the RSC commissioned this, and initially I was asked to write a play for their smaller space called The Other Place. And when they read my treatment, which was 1 page, I was immediately given a commission for the Swan, which is a much bigger theatre. So I'm very thankful to the RSC, the little manager who dramaturged the piece, Pippa Hill, for recognising the importance of the play. We knew we had an important play in our hands. Then we went into lockdown, and then George Floyd died. It exploded the play. And then the statues, the rows in America with the Confederate legacy, and then Edward Colston and having to remove statues of slaveholders from around the West India Docks Museum and the British Museum. So by April, I was constantly on TV and radio being asked about the whip and the legacy of slavery and Black Lives Matter, and the way it all fed in. If you'd asked me at the beginning of the year, would we be, number one, in lockdown because of a global pandemic, and that the play would reach an even wider audience, even though theatres were closed, because as I said, I mean, you know, I've done, you know, national and international interviews about this. I wouldn't have believed it if anybody had said so. I can't, underestimate how important I would say, international response has been to Black Lives Matter, and the difference this time round, because, you know, we had Rodney King. As I said, I've worked in news for many years. Rodney King was beaten. We had Eric Garner. You know, we had Martin Luther King and his "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington. The difference by the summer was that everybody cared about racial justice. You know, we had celebrities joining in. When you see the Amish leaving, you know, their communities and standing at roadsides, holding up placards saying Black Lives Matter, that's mind-blowing. Unfortunately, now we're seeing backlash, pushback, and it always happens. You know, it gets us to a saturation point, and then things slowly come back to a status quo. But this time around, I don't think it will. And I think that, so to deal with your second part, my message is to everyone as a result of all of this is solidarity. You know, we in circumstances, particularly where racial justice is concerned, we depend on our friends to not be silent. Silence is not acceptable. You know, we are all activists for human rights. This is a human rights issue. And it was amazing to see how international it had become. It's becoming quite toxic, and a lot of that has to do with so-called cultural wars and what is happening in the United States, and how Black Lives Matter has been weaponized. And sadly, I think white communities in America are being terrified that the messages, you know, your Black neighbors are going to overrun your neighborhoods and your homes if you give an inch. Because, to be honest, where racial justice is concerned, it is about compromise, and someone has to give something. And I think we reached a point in August where people wanted to give. there's pushback, but we need to fight through. As I said, I've been here before with Rodney King and Eric Garner and others. You know, it's not right. But I have enough faith in humanity to think that, and as the whip shows, what happens when we find common ground? What happens when we can see that, you know, slavery
We seem to have lost Juliet for a minute there, and Joy's a Zoom. So I'll just wait a minute because I can see several of you have got questions. So I'll hopefully get to ask those when she gets back, but we'll just wait a second if you don't mind hanging on.
Well, it's certainly been an exciting night with lots of news, lots of new information. I think Juliet has left us with a kind of responsibility to follow up these things. And she said it's not a history, she's not giving a history lesson. She's writing from an authentic place. She's used her own creativity to interpret history. And for me, I see it like a baton passing on. So we're not just passive receivers of her play, but we're just passive. We need to do something. We in our small way, just like Juliet is doing, there is space for activism and for change. Have we got her back?
I think
yes, I'm back. I don't know what happened. I'm back.
That's great.
I was filling in.
I bet.
I was trying to do it.
In that vein, Juliet, I think at least 4 of the questions in the chat have been involving, will the play be toured? It's so significant.
Yeah.
Do you have any plans to extend it, make it more available, tour it again when we're allowed back in the theatre?
We really hope that it will be back. Number one, we are trying to get it onto the national school curriculum. This is really important because, again, it's that history that we do not know. And it's our history, it's British history. This is not a single issue play. This is something that we can all benefit from. And because of what's happening politically, we all need understanding. And if we understand our past, we have a better chance of understanding each other and creating a better society and world. And also, you know, there had been interested in the States, and then unfortunately, you know, they got shut down. New York got shut down. So these are unprecedented times, but the hope is that it will come back.
That's really great to know. We've got one other question, which I think you touched on a little bit, but when you were talking about how the actors responded to playing out some of the more traumatic scenes of this play. But one of our audience members has asked, how do you personally deal with the violence against slaves that you uncovered during your research?
It was hard. There are things that I read that are not in this play. There are things that I won't even describe here because it's so upsetting. You know, when you have I don't know whether anyone's been watching the Samuel L. Jackson Afua Hirsch series on BBC Two, and they do touch on the fact that, you know, there would be trap doors to where the slaves were held, and children and women would be taken out to be used and abused sexually. You know, medical experiments, and terrible punishments. It's hard, but and a bit like with when I was writing about the First World War, I found that was horrendous. You know, I found it really difficult. I don't like war. And the things that I read about how young men died and expired in gas attacks, absolutely horrendous. But, you know, as a journalist, as a dramatist, I think it's really important to, you have to go there. It's a bit like a photojournalist. You know, if you're covering a war, you have to show images. Otherwise, people won't know. It's really important, and I just had to kind of remember why I write, and not be gratuitous either. I think that's one thing that I think is important to avoid. If you're going to use violence or talk about, you know, difficult aspects of human bondage, whether it's in mills, where children, I read accounts at the British Library about children being kicked to death for falling asleep, having their ears nailed to desks, terrible things, weights hung around their necks. I found that really upsetting, but it was there, large and writ, you know. So again, these are things that people need to know. We need to know our past.
Brilliant. I think just one more question then. What are you writing next? Where do you go from here?
Oh my goodness. So I'm sort of writing a sequel, but I can't really talk about that. I've got a couple of projects, and one of them actually is going to be contemporary. It's going to be looking at criminal justice in this country. And I've just done Medea, actually, slightly different. So I've written, German theatre gathered 15 playwrights to retell the stories of women of Greek tragedy. And I rewrote Medea. And that Medea is being played by Nadine Marshall and directed by Adjoa Ando. I was very interested, number one, you know, this whole idea about infanticide, and I learned that her story had been rewritten because in previous Greek plays, Medea didn't kill her children. I was very interested why men decided to rewrite her like that. And also she's constantly described as a barbarian. And I was interested in that because barbarian means foreigner, outsider. And what we see in Europe, particularly with refugees being denied access or having their tent camps burnt down, I wanted to explore those themes of exile. And I've written Medea as a Black woman who finds herself in a society where she isn't accepted. But I'm not going to say any more because you need to tune in for that. Those are being filmed and they'll go out digitally. But I don't know what the classicists will make of my take of Medea, but it's different.
Brilliant. I can't wait to see those. I'm going to be looking out for those. Thank you so much, Juliet, for a really, really wonderful presentation and excellent answers to the questions. And thank you also to Ifemu Omari-Webber as well for being our interrogator today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.